change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And then the Philistines, after being defeated, they try to go do the same thing again. And so they're all gathered again to the very same place. And so they had to have been thinking that they should have won that first battle, and they have no idea why they lost. So they're willing to try it again. And maybe they're going to change a couple strategies or tactics. And David here, he could just think, well, we beat you once, and so we'll beat you again. So you want some more of this? Well, we'll give it to you. Where didn't we just do this? We'll just do it again the same way. Of course, God would do it the same way. Why would we need to ask him again? But David, he's not like that, because he's seeking the Lord in everything that comes up. And so he doesn't assume that the Lord's going to do it the same way every time. And it's a real good thing that David did seek the Lord, because God, he had a different plan. And this time when David sought the Lord, it wasn't just a yes or no answer. But the answer to the first question about going up against a Philistine was a no. And then the second part, God gave him specific instructions of how to go up. And he says to go behind them and to climb the trees, and not just any trees, but the mulberry trees that are in a specific place. And so you don't go climb the oaks, and you don't climb the sycamores, and you don't climb the acacia trees. It's only the mulberry trees. That's the place you're going to need to be. And then when you climb those trees, you're going to wait. And you're going to wait till you hear something that sounds like marching, something specific. And it doesn't say that they hear the Philistines marching, but it could be that. But it could be anything. It could be maybe it's the angels marching, or maybe it's just the wind. But you need to be in this specific place, and at a specific time you need to go when you hear that, because that's when I'm going to be with you. And that's what happened. And when they attacked this time, what it did is it cut the Philistines off from their path of retreat, where they had to flee this time northward toward the flee of the Ajalon Valley instead of going directly to Gezer. And we're told that they did chase them from Gibeon down to Gezer, and that's a distance of 15 to 20 miles. And because of this victory, David was able to take back all the cities and territories that were lost by Saul in his last battle against the Philistines. All right, so now we get to chapter 6, and now we see David. He's gathering 30,000 of what's called the choice men of Israel. But this isn't thought to be all military personnel, but this is thought to be prominent leaders in Israel from all the different regions and the cities, and this would have included the priests and many of the Levites. And they're all invited to assemble where it says Baal Judah, which is the same place that we know as Kirjath Jearim, which is a territory in Benjamin, not in Judah. And David's plan is to take all these people with him to bring back the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, to the city of Jerusalem. Because besides David making Jerusalem Israel's political capital, David also wants to make Jerusalem the spiritual capital, that the city of Jerusalem would become the center of spiritual life in Israel. And to do this, David, he needs to bring the Ark back. And if you remember, the Ark of the Covenant, it's been at Abinadab's house since 1 Samuel chapter 7, which means It's now been over 75 years since the Ark of the Covenant has been in the Holy of Holies at the tabernacle in Shiloh. And if you remember, that's with Eli the priest and Hophni and Phinehas. And it's very possible here that the actual tabernacle has been destroyed by this time. And so David's plan is to bring back the ark and to place it into a new tabernacle. And he's putting that up in the city. And a tabernacle, all that is just a tent. And to refresh our memories of what the Ark of the Covenant is, the Ark of the Covenant is just a wooden box about the size of a coffee table or a hope chest. So it's less than 4 feet long and 2.5 feet wide with a height of about 2.5 feet. But it's all covered in pure gold. And it has a solid gold lid, which is called the mercy seat, which is overshadowed by 2 golden angels looking down at the seat with their wings touching. And if you would take the lid off and you looked inside the chest, you would see the 2 tablets of the law, which is the 10 commandments that were written by the very finger of God, along with a jar of manna and along with the rod of Aaron that budded. But you really wouldn't want to take that lid off because they tried that once, and it was a lot like that scene from the Raiders of the Lost Ark with Indiana Jones, where over 50,000 people died. And that was at Beth Shemesh. And it was all because they took that lid off. And that was because when the ark one day just showed up by itself on a new cart being pulled by 2 milking cows, because that's the way that the Philistines sent it away, because even though God had allowed the Philistines to capture the ark, the Philistines couldn't dwell with the ark because of the presence of a holy God, because God's presence was killing them. And we don't really know why the people of Beth Shemesh took the mercy seat off, but maybe it was to see if the stone tablets of the law were still there after being in the Philistines' possession. But it was a big mistake for them, because you can't look at the law of God without God's mercy. And it was on that mercy seat where the blood for the atonement for sin was made every year. And that blood of atonement, it actually represents Jesus's blood, because Jesus is the Lamb of God. But the men from Beth Shemesh, they ended up concluding that this ark was too dangerous to be kept around them. And so that's how this ark ended up at Abinadab's house. And so now the ark, it's been sitting around Abinadab's living room or in the back of his garage for about 70 years now. And King Saul, he never had a place in his kingdom for the ark or anything that represented the presence of God. So that ark sat stored away and was almost forgotten for years until David, who saw things differently, where David had a desire for God personally and wanted God's presence to be the central focus of his kingdom, that God would finally have his rightful place as the real king of the nation, where Israel would become this united nation under God. And everyone was excited about this move. Everyone was excited about bringing God back into their lives. But there is one thing that we don't read about here regarding this move, because we don't read here that David ever inquired of the Lord. And so there's no mention of the mind of the Lord in this moving the ark to Jerusalem. Where up until now, we saw David inquire about everything that he does. But in this area, the scripture's silent. But there sure is a lot of excitement, because the people, they get real busy and they make all these plans and they're building this new cart, because it wouldn't be right to just use some old cart that Abinadab had laying around the farm to put the ark on. So you have to have this new cart. And it probably was the Cadillac of carts. It was probably highly decorated, something that looks like you'd want to put an ark of God on it. And it was the very best that a committee of men could come up with. And then you're going to take the actual men who've been caring for this ark, and you're going to put them in this parade, and they're going to be the ones who drive the cart. And so these men here, they're called the sons of Amminadab, but they were probably in reality the grandsons or the great-grandsons of Amminadab, because it's been 70 years and there is no word for grandsons in Hebrew, so they're called sons. And so then you have Uzzah and Ahio. And I don't know anyone who'd want to name their son Ahio, because it sounds just way too much like Ohio. All you're doing is you're just kind of changing the first letter, and then you think Ohio State. And this really almost ruins the whole story here. But anyways, Ahio, he'll be leading the oxen. And then you got Uzzah, the loser, and he'll be walking alongside the cart on this grand parade to Jerusalem. And then you have David, and he's along with all the musicians, and they have all these fur instruments. They have like these guitars and harps and tambourines and all these other kind of stringed instruments and cymbals. And so this is really starting to look kind of like a folk music festival. It's kind of like an early Woodstock, where they're all gathering in this farmer's field with over 30,000 people. And they're all going to march this slow 10.5-mile march to the city of Jerusalem. And so they start the party. And the musicians, they start to play. It's probably something kind of slow and groovy, something that makes you kind of want to move and dance. And all these people, they're lining up. And everything here for the people is exciting, because this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. It's big. It's something never to be repeated. And nobody has ever been to anything like this before. And they're all enjoying it. All the singing and all the dancing, the worship, and everybody's feeling it. And everybody's enjoying it. Everybody's enjoying it. All except for God. God, he's not enjoying it. And that's because this worship service wasn't being done God's way. And God, he actually has a way that he wants to be worshiped here. But this service here, this was put together from the best of men's ideas. But it's not by God's instructions. But God had given instructions on the moving of the ark. But nobody here, they knew the difference until they got to Nachon's threshing floor and one of the oxen tripped. And the cart started to topple, and Uzzah, the loser, he grabbed the ark of God and he tried to stabilize it, and he was instantly struck dead by God. And then everything stopped. Because what they were doing here, it was the right thing. Because it was right to bring the ark of God to Jerusalem, to make God the center of the spiritual life in Israel. So what they were doing was right, but they were doing it the wrong way. And it's like these people were judging this worship service the same way that we often can judge a worship service, where we judge the service by the way it makes us feel. But what really matters isn't how we feel at all, but it's how it makes God feel. That if God's pleased with it, and though everyone here, they were all hoping that God would show up at their worship service, they just didn't like the way he showed up. Because although it was the right thing to do, they did it the wrong way. And God, he has a way. And his way is not the same way as their way, because their way was just the best of whatever man could come up with by a committee of men. And then you have to think, where did this committee of men come up with this great idea of putting the ark of God on a cart? Because they didn't get it from God. They got it from the world. In fact, they got it from the enemies of God. They got it from the Philistines, because that's the way the Philistines sent the ark back to Israel, on a new cart. But it was out of God's mercy that God allowed the Philistines to return the ark that way, because they didn't know any better. They were just Philistines. But God, he wasn't going to accept that kind of disrespect from his own children because they should know better. Because all the priests there and all the Levites, they would have known better. And even if you just looked at the ark, you would have been able to figure it out. Because the ark, it has these permanent golden rings on its sides with these permanent poles that are covered with gold that were never to be removed from the ark, to be carried by the descendants of only one family of the Levites, those from the family of Kohath. And we have no evidence that Abinadab or his sons were descended from Kohath, let alone being Levites. We don't even know if they were even allowed to be able to touch the poles of the ark. So they really should have known better. Though David, he probably didn't know. But God's not going to let him get away with not reverencing him as holy or his word as holy. And so they didn't get very far. And the best that I can figure out, they only got about a half a mile because the distance between Jerusalem and Kirjath Jearim is about 10 and a half miles. And the distance from Obed-Edom's house is believed to be about 10 miles away. And that's where they ended up putting the ark after Uzzah's death. And that's where the ark is going to stay there for the next 3 months. Because David, he got really mad at God for killing Uzzah, to the point where David didn't want anything to do with God's presence being with him in Jerusalem, because now David, he's afraid of God. And I believe there's a difference between having the fear of God and being afraid of God. Because if they had a fear of God, they would have moved the ark the way that God had prescribed it, and by carrying it on the shoulders of the sons of Kohath, because that would be showing a fear of God. That means that you're reverencing him and that you're obeying him and you're obeying his word. And if that happened, David wouldn't now be afraid of God, because being afraid of God is what happens when we're disobedient to God. But I don't believe David knew that they were moving the ark was wrong. But even not knowing it was wrong, it was still wrong, and God couldn't bless it. And I think this is the same way it is with our worship services, that we just can't bring in whatever we want and expect the Lord to be there and to bless it, no matter how exciting we can make it. And just because it's exciting and the people are all excited with everybody's toes tapping and their hips swaying, it doesn't mean that the Lord is pleased with it. And it doesn't mean that the Lord is even present. And I'm not trying to tell you exactly what worship should look like, but if God is not pleased with the worship, then it's not worship. And we shouldn't be getting our cues for worship from the world, which means we don't need the light shows and we don't need the smoke machines. Though I've never seen the light shows or the smoke machines, but I hear a lot about those. And our worship services, they should never be led by people who don't know the Lord or who have a compromised walk with God, no matter how talented they are. But at this time, David, he's content not to have the ark of God with him until he heard that the house of Obed-Edom was being blessed by God. And David wanted that blessing for himself, and David wanted it for Israel. And you can read a whole nother account of this same event in 1 Chronicles in chapter 15, where in the book of Chronicles, it's written from a different viewpoint. It's written from the viewpoint of the priests. But in that account, that's where we learn that David was told and became aware that it was only the Levites who could carry the ark of God, and that the ark was to be carried on their shoulders. And some people, they might think, well, shouldn't worship be received by God as long as it's sincere? And the worshiper, they really mean it? But the truth is, it's never been that way. That there's only ever been one way to come to God, and it's always been to come to him his way. That God, he wants us to come, but it has to be his way. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus said and told the Samaritan woman at the well that the hour is coming and now is that true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, where the important word here is in truth. It's not in worship him in sincerity or to worship him with your emotions or with all this great excitement. And if you remember Cain and Abel, he tried to come his own ways and to bring his good works, but it was rejected by God. Where Abel, he came God's way. He came by sacrifice. And there's no amount of enthusiasm that can ever make up for disobedience to God's word. And so this thing that they thought was going to be this one-time event that ended in disaster, well, now they're going to make a second attempt. So now it's going to be like Woodstock 2. And now David, he's going to do the right thing the right way. And so he gathers all the musicians again. And then the music, it begins to flow. But this time, the sons of Kohath, they're carrying the ark on their shoulders. And now they begin their 10-mile hike. And after they took 6 steps, they paused and they offered up a bull and a fatted calf, which is also different than the first time. The first time, they didn't have a sacrifice. And now, with no judgment falling on them, they knew that God was pleased. And in 1 Chronicles 17, we're told that when they reached the tent in Jerusalem, the priests, they offered up another 14 more sacrifices. And I'll be honest that some people, they teach this passage and they'll teach that they offered up the same sacrifice every 6 steps they took, all the way to Jerusalem. But people are divided on this. But with that kind of distance, that would be over 5,000 sacrifices with 10,000 animals. And then you'd have all this blood and guts all the way, the whole path, all the way to Jerusalem. And the text doesn't really say that's what they did. But however it was, David, he worshiped here, and he worshiped with everything inside him, where he had even set aside his royal robes, and he only wore a linen ephod, which is the same exact simple dress that all the priests were wearing. And so he looked just like everyone else in the procession, where he wouldn't have stood out in any way except for maybe some of his dance moves. And this is the closest that David ever gets to being like a priest, where he's worshiping in the very presence of the ark of God. And there were only 3 anointed positions or offices that you could hold in Israel. There's the prophet, there's the priest, and there's the king. And David was 2 of them. He was a prophet and he was a king. But really, he may have preferred to have been a priest, to be serving in God's temple, because you'll always see him repeatedly writing about that in the Psalms, about being in the house of the Lord and serving God. And David, he did have the moves. And so we're kind of pretty sure he was a Pentecostal, and he has all this whirling and twirling. And so I get the sense this is much more than like a square dance or a polka. Maybe with all that leaping, maybe it looked more like a ballet, but I kind of see this as like a more freestyle kind of hippie dance. And I don't know, it really could have been much more like a Jewish dance like you'd see in a Jewish wedding, like a line dance.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,